Earlier, you saw Brazil handing over to the presidency of the G20 to South Africa. And South Africa, of course, officially taking over from the 1st of December, with the focus now having completely shifted from Brazil to Gauteng, which will host the summit. This is a province that has the largest share of the South African population, with approximately 15.8 million people. It boasts the Sandton's bustling business district, which is often referred to as Africa's richest square mile. Now, the city of Joburg, known as a world-class African city, is no stranger to hosting big events. And Sophie Mokoena, international news editor, joins us again now. Sophie, South Africa's G20 theme is solidarity, equality and sustainability. About 130 meetings will be held in the country. Let's talk about the capabilities of a province like Gauteng, for example, as it prepares to host yet another big event.
You would recall that it was in this province in 1994 where the first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela, was inaugurated. And we saw one of the biggest events in South Africa where you had many world leaders converging in the province, but in Pretoria, the capital city. You have Johannesburg in 2002, where the World Summit on Sustainable Development, or the Earth Summit, was conducted, or where it was underway in 2002. Even then, you had many world leaders. It was a UN summit, and therefore you had many world leaders from around the world. And you know that when you look at the province like Gauteng, you can have a smooth progression in terms of issues related to transport, from rail to road, including air. When you look at the airports, you have the OR Tambo International Airport, you have Waterkloof, you have Lanseria, you also have a private landing strip near the OR International Airport. And therefore, in terms of arrivals, you are certain that you will have a smooth landing for all those heads of state and government. In terms of hospitality, you have lots and lots of hotels, B&Bs and other accommodations. The other important issue, I'm going to step out of the shot. This is Johannesburg at night on my background here. When you look at this picture, you will see that right around here, this is Johannesburg at night. And you look there, you see a red light there and a tall building that is the Sandton Square. And this is where you have the Sandton Convention Center, where you can have your conference. We saw last year the BRICS Summit, the conference was at this Sandton Convention, and therefore Gauteng or Johannesburg is capable of hosting big events. But as you pan to the right, I'm going to ask my colleague to pan to the right. You also have a landmark tower there. We often call it the Telkom Tower, and you can see this is Johannesburg, and it is by no coincidence that it is one of the most beautiful and largest cities on the continent. And therefore, I think the government took a decision to host this summit, the G20 Summit next year in Johannesburg, because of the infrastructure, because of accommodation, because of transport. And with experience, you are guaranteed that this province will be able to host that kind of a conference. You'd recall also during the passing on of the former president Nelson Mandela, we had so many heads of states arriving during the memorial at the FNB Stadium. And therefore, Johannesburg is a place to be next year during the summit. But as you pointed out, the president indicating that in terms of these meetings ahead of the main summit, these meetings, some of them will be in different provinces. For example, a province like KwaZulu-Natal, a province like Western Cape, they are able also to host large gatherings, but smaller province, you will then decide the meetings of technocrats as planning gets underway. And therefore, I think this will be an opportunity for South Africa to really promote the country and also to ensure that they are able to demonstrate to international investors that South Africa is still standing and it is a place to be Bongiwe.
And also, of course, the focus areas, Sophie, becoming inclusive economic growth. And in part, you're thinking about jobs that a lot of people then be looking to see if they will then be able to, you know, take part in this. Because when you listen to the president earlier, it also talks about the fact that ordinary South Africans must be involved. They need to also know what is happening in their backyard as part of this inclusive growth.
Yes, I think the intention is to ensure that all these meetings, you are able to take small business on board. You do create jobs. Some of them, they might end up being permanent. Others, of course, it will be temporary jobs. But at least you will be able to assist those who are not employed. You know that during the World Cup, South Africa did prepare in terms of hosting of the World Cup. Years before the World Cup got underway, you know that South Africa made commitments in terms of a bid book, putting aside money and appointing technical teams and starting early, and that created jobs. And when the preparation started, when South Africa won that bid in Zurich, where Madiba was, I think then the work started and you were able to create jobs. Today, much as you might have critics, but the reality is South Africa was able to build infrastructure. When you look at soccer as a sport in South Africa, you have where you can play soccer and therefore even sharing the facilities with the neighbors. And therefore it is projects such as this that can be used to develop South Africa and build into ensuring that you have this much talked about inclusive growth. Unfortunately, you know, due to the economic meltdown of 2008, but also COVID-19, those gains that were made in terms of preparing for World Cup 2010, we did regress. And this is the time to rebuild.
And rebuild indeed. And I'd like us, just before we continue, to take this tweet from the presidency saying that it's an honor to accept on behalf of the people of South Africa the responsibility of the presidency of the G20 for the next year. And that's the president there, Cyril Ramaphosa, as he was accepting this honor a little earlier on. And Sophie, interestingly, he also talks about something that is very critical, especially now that the G20 includes the African Union as a full member for the very first time. He says South Africa is not only going to be pushing its own concerns, but it's going to be driving the African agenda.
Since 1994, South Africa has always been at the forefront in terms of the development of the continent. Any small achievement, South Africa does take the continent on board. That is why even in 2010, the World Cup, it was not South Africa's time, but Africa's time. And therefore, even now, this important gathering, South Africa wants to ensure that the continent does benefit. Of course, the neighboring countries will be able to benefit in relation to the spin-offs. But also with the AU now a full member of the G20, you would then include or infuse the African continental free trade area. Because when you do business with big countries as a continent, you're talking about almost 2 billion people. That's a massive GDP, and therefore it's better to attack or to be involved as a bigger group as the continent. And you know that you saw that the president of Nigeria was there, the president of Tanzania as the incoming chair of the AU next year, she was there, and you had also the president of Egypt. And therefore, that is why you had these leaders also meeting on the margins of the G20. And therefore, this is more of a G20 of the developing nations.
And of course, as he says, even the SDGs becoming the big focus ahead of 2020 and 2030 rather. And this cannot be done, if the conflicts in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, South Sudan, as well as the crisis in the DRC as well is not resolved. Let's leave it there with you, Sophie. Thank you so much for your time. That was Sophie Mokoena, SABC News International Editor.